Welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. For July 18th, 2024, the Fight, Fight, Fight edition. I'm John Dickerson. I'm joined by Mary Harris, the host of Slate's daily news podcast, What Next? I should say, first, Emily and David are off this week. They're out seeking their source for something definitive. I am drunk with power because I'm in total control here. I am in charge here.
You are running the board.
I am running the board. And as I run the board, I'm going to force Mary to answer the following questions on three topics. The first will be what to make of James David Vance, who is now the Republican nominee for vice president, known to his friends and the public as JD Vance. Our second topic will be the general state of the presidential race, in which the Republican Party at their national convention in Milwaukee smells not just victory, but a landslide. Mary is there in Milwaukee, so we're going to get lots of on-the-ground sights and sounds and feelings from her. We'll also talk about the Democratic Party, which is spending its week constructing new dramas of woe. And finally, we'll address the attempt on Donald Trump's life, the assassination attempt, and what to make of the conversation that has taken place afterward. And our Slate Plus will be how the Democrats should respond with their own convention, which they're going to carry off. Then we'll have, of course, chatter.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Simply Safe. Imagine a burglary at your home. If you're picturing a shady character sneaking about under the cloak of night, you may be surprised to learn that according to the FBI, most break-ins happen during broad daylight and spike during the summer when more homes sit unattended and the days grow longer. That's why you need Simply Safe home security now. For those seeking an extra sense of security, Simply Safe offers an impressive range of user-friendly products and features, prioritizing convenience, affordability, and effectiveness to provide peace of mind. It's invaluable for those planning vacations and wanting to ensure their homes remain secure while they're away. With Fast Protect monitoring and Live Guard protection, Simply Safe agents can act within 5 seconds of receiving your alarm and can even see and speak to intruders to stop them in their tracks. Protect your home this summer with 20% off any new Simply Safe system when you sign up for Fast Protect monitoring. Just visit simplysafe.com/gabfest. That's simplysafe.com/gabfest. There's no safe like Simply Safe. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by public.com. At public.com, you can earn 5.1% APY with a high-yield cash account. 5.1%. That is an industry-leading rate. Plus, there are no fees, like zero, so you can maximize your interest. Because what's the point of earning a high yield if you have to spend a bunch of it on fees? At public.com, it's just 5.1% APY straight up and no strings attached. They don't even have balance requirements, so you can deposit as little or as much as you want. And Public provides up to $5 million of FDIC insurance. That's 20 times the standard coverage. So, to recap, that's 5.1% interest with no fees, 5.1% interest with no minimums or maximums, 5.1% interest up to $5 million FDIC insurance. Start earning an industry-leading 5.1% APY on your cash. Public.com. This is a paid advertisement for Public investing. 5.1% APY as of June 17th, 2024, and is subject to change. Full disclosures in the podcast description.
So, Mary, I want to start. You are there.
I am here.
You're there. Let's just give us your sense of what's happening so far this week. We're talking on Thursday. Donald Trump has not spoken. What's it been like? What's your assessment of it so far?
I mean, the vibe is invincibility, I would say. I mean, you talk to anyone here, and this is a real party. People feel unified. I mean, everyone knows there are tiny disagreements under the surface, but they just don't seem to care. It's like, we got this, man. Let's do it.
And how much of that is the result of Donald Trump's the assassination attempt and his return from it, the fist fight from the stage, the sense that this man who they have great affection for is up on his feet? How much of it is about that, and how much of it is about the other part of politics? And of course, they're all mixed together. But
this is going to sound weird for me to say it this way, but the assassination attempt was like the cherry on top. Like, I feel like people here were feeling invincible before that. You know, Trump was doing very well in the polls before the debate. My colleague Jim Newell, before any of this, was like, he's going into this convention in an incredibly strong position, stronger than a lot of Republicans have had for a very long while. Then you have the debate performance. Then you have what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania on Saturday. And, I was really struck by this reporting the Times had right after the assassination attempt took place in Butler, where someone in the crowd said, this was the day Donald Trump won the election. And it was immediate. That was the immediate response. And that response has carried through. You can see it in the delegates who have embraced this fight, fight, fight chant that Trump did as soon as he was shot. Like the second he bobbed his head up, he was doing it. And it's really, really carried through here.
And, on the one hand, conventions are massive unity experiences anyway, except in 2016, Ted Cruz didn't endorse Trump from the stage. And Donald Trump was accused by the leaders in the Senate and the House after January 6th of fomenting the attack on the Capitol. After 2022, Republicans, when Donald Trump's candidates didn't do very well in the Senate races, they said, he's over. So he was over after January 6th. He was over after 2022. Ron DeSantis was polling well ahead of him in some of the polls. And so it feels like, to me, this is like the second comeback. He came back from the assassination, but he's had a massive comeback since his party was basically like, we're done with you after you contributed to this violence.
Well, and just look at who's here, right? We had Nikki Haley, who was, really holding back a full-throated endorsement. She spoke from the stage and really made the argument for Trump and made the argument for being there on her own terms. And you saw Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who didn't speak with Trump for more than 3 years, be the person from Kentucky who offered the delegates for his nomination to be president of the United States. He got booed as he did it, but he was there and he wanted to give the thumbs up to Trump. So you're seeing all of these people just come around and say, all right, we're doing this, and embracing it.
Yeah. Mitch McConnell, whose wife Trump described with, I think it's fair to say, a racial epithet, and also Nikki Haley received essentially somewhat similar treatment from Trump. So they, in coming back to support him, they also share the sublimation of those personal insults. All right. So now, speaking of people who have had a journey with Donald Trump, JD Vance. Nobody, I think this is fair, in the parade of people who once opposed Donald Trump and who spoke at the convention has said harsher things about Donald Trump than JD Vance. He called him America's Hitler. He compared him to an opioid. So that's enough of that. What's your opinion of the pick, Mary? And well, let's just start with the pick, and then we'll do the theater review of Vance's speech.
Okay, so it's funny. You said no one has said harsher things about Donald Trump than JD Vance. No one has said harsher things than JD Vance. Like, you can just Google around and find all sorts of things he said that are incredibly inflammatory. Okay, like, I think Trump should fire every single mid-level bureaucrat in the U.S. government and replace them with, quote unquote, our people. Who boy? Okay. We have, railing against the U.S. government being controlled by childless cat ladies. And then, of course, you have, after Saturday, the assassination attempt. He immediately gets online and says, this is what happened here was the result of Democratic rhetoric. He's not afraid to troll. I would even say trolling is a big part of his brand. What's interesting to me, like, I did an interview a while ago when he was running for Senate with a guy who had really followed him around and tried to understand who is JD Vance. How did he get here? How did he get from being one of Trump's biggest critics? Of course, there's this infamous text message he sent to a law school roommate, where he really despairs about Trump and talks about him as, possibly America's Hitler. How did he go from that to running for Senate, really bending the knee to Trump? He did a lot of talking about how, he's embraced this NatCon, new right philosophy, which we can get into. But the thing he said that I think is really interesting to talk about given JD Vance's speech and JD Vance's trollishness is he said he's a veteran code switcher. Like he's just good at playing to all kinds of audiences at once and going back and forth. And I feel like you could so see that in the speech from the RNC stage. You know, of course, we just talked about how trollish he is. He didn't come across as trollish in that speech. He was constantly going back and forth between being a sort of philosopher of this new brand of republicanism and then talking about his grandmother and these sort of quote unquote funny asides about things like she had a bunch of loaded guns stored in her house that they found when she died, which was like a big surprising to me, like a ha 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 laugh line. So it's like he's just this interesting character, but he's also really has sharp edges. And I think it's just going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, we'll get to the shooting and the response to it in the third topic, but I'm so glad you raised that because of all the intemperate responses, at a moment when the rest of the political class on both sides were saying, you know, we need to tone down the rhetoric, he was coming forward with obviously an evidence-free claim because nobody knew what the motivations of the shooter were, and thinking the worst and attacking Democrats for it very soon after the shooting. And now, of course, the FBI has briefed lawmakers on Wednesday that there is no evidence that it was politically motivated. But anyway, we'll get back to that. But you're right. I mean, one of the most, if not the most intemperate reaction from somebody in a position of responsibility. What did you make of the thrust of the speech with respect to, and I thought it was quite effective. And as you said, it had a kind of a nice literary bounce between authentic stories. That was essentially little riffs from Hillbilly Elegy, his New York Times bestselling book, which throughout established his bona fides as a spokesman from sort of the forgotten part of America. Also, the way he talked about the various ways in which Washington politicians had sold out that part of America by using the timeline of his life and Joe Biden's career, accentuating the age of the likely Democratic nominee, although we'll get to that. But particularly his anti-Wall Street rhetoric. What do you make of that and the sincerity of it?
I think it's sincere. I don't know what it means, and I'm also not sure if where he's looking for blame is the right place. Like, okay, I'm looking at what I jotted down when he was giving his speech. He talked about, we're done catering to Wall Street. We'll commit to the working man. He talked about we're done importing foreign labor. We'll fight for American wages and jobs, which is just so interesting to me because we've just seen Joe Biden, really prioritize American jobs with the infrastructure bill he passed. So it's interesting, right? We're done buying energy from countries that hate us. We'll get it from Pennsylvania and Ohio. I mean, we are producing more energy domestically than I think any other country right now. Like this is not a problem, right? And then he talked about housing, which I think is something that is very meaningful to people. People really can't afford to find a place to live right now. And this was such an interesting pivot. He said, there's an affordability crisis and we have migrants competing for housing with us, and that's what's driving the prices up. And I was like, not sure about that. But you're hitting on something that's really important to people. And I think in the end, that's what came through to me about this speech. To me, the most affecting thing about the speech was he had his mother in the audience and he spoke to her. And he talked about, hey, Mom, you've been clean and sober. Those are his words for 10 years. And why don't we celebrate your anniversary of sobriety in the White House? And I looked at her and I was like, wow, this is very affecting. And to me, it was kind of the moment of it. Like the appearance of things made sense to me. And then when you dig into it, what do you think the origin story of this is? I was like, maybe not. But the appearance, I think, was very strong.
Yeah, I think conventions are mostly about what happens within a party and within a hall to unify everybody so then they can go out and, take on the rest of the election. I mean, they don't often convince massive swaths of undecided voters or people who aren't paying attention, because people who aren't paying attention until they, check into the campaign a little bit later. But as a unifying exercise, his personal story of coming from the place that has been forgotten, with Donald Trump's pitch affirmed by speakers and the general vibe of the place, which is that he is a fighter for all of them, whether they're forgotten by Washington elites or elites in general, or just at an economic level or at a cultural level. It all felt very in sync. It all felt like, and I loved your word, invincible. It's not nothing to have a party emerge from its convention not just unified, but with several boxes of power bars to sustain them through the rest of the campaign.
And of course, that's the point of these conventions, right? Like, I talked to Christy Todd Whitman, who's been to like a zillion RNCs before I went to this, because I was like, give me some advice. And she was basically like, this is a little treat for the delegates to power them through, even though she hates where it's ended up. She basically hates where it's ended up because she's no longer invited to the party. But that's what this is.
And so those contradictions and the questions of Wall Street, you have JD Vance attacking Wall Street on the week that Bloomberg prints an interview with Donald Trump in which Donald Trump floats Jamie Dimon as his Treasury Secretary, Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan. You have lobbyists and corporate interests funding lots of the parties and gliding the path for the swells at the convention, as they will be doing at the Democratic convention, while you have this anti-corporate message, which I should say, Sean O'Brien, Teamster president on Monday night. What did you make of his speech and his attack on, this is just about an hour after Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, who was formerly of the private equity firm, the Carlyle Group, who made a great fortune and represents the interests of business. What did you make of Sean O'Brien's speech? And again, does that do anything beyond what it did for the crowd that night, which was, you got kind of a mixed response?
Yeah, I couldn't figure out from Sean O'Brien and the reaction to Sean O'Brien how much of having him there was about embracing like a vibe or a style of republicanism versus like actually policy positions. Like, I say that because I met a delegate from Texas. I started asking delegates just what is a Republican, because I think we haven't really talked about this, but choosing JD Vance amid all of this like unity conversation, it kind of papers over the fact that there is a big change happening in republicanism. And I promise I'm getting back to Sean O'Brien. So I talked to this Texas delegate, and I was asking her this question. I was asking a couple of people, like, what is republicanism now? And she was really interesting. She was like, well, there's been this kind of quiet civil war going on. And she was very much on the national conservative populist side. And so I was like, okay, so what does that mean to you? NATO? No, obviously not NATO. I asked about Sean O'Brien. I was like, Sean O'Brien spoke. So are you a pro-union party now? And she's like, we're pro-worker, which is an interesting distinction to me. The other thing that she said is, I was like, well, so JD Vance was picked as vice president. You said there was a slow civil war going on. Do you think that means you won? And she was like, yes. And it was interesting. It really, to me, shows that there's this big change going on that is being camouflaged by this show of unity to Trump, where we're not really talking about the details so much. We're talking about vibes. We're talking about good times. When you ask any of the delegates, like, what is republicanism? Who's here? And they're like, it's all love. That's the top line. That's not a policy. So it'll be interesting to me to see how that carries forward.
Any other last thoughts about JD Vance? The tactical approach, as the campaign has talked about it, is basically they're going to plant him in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, go after those working class voters.
Yeah, and he nodded to that from the floor. He was like, oh, let's, Ohio, quiet down. We want to hear from Michigan, wink, wink. He really wanted to make it clear he's Mr. Midwest. And that's, if I'm a Democrat, those are warning lights blinking, right? That they're just going for states where Democrats have made real inroads. People have talked about Wisconsin as maybe now being a blue state. Michigan, it's got a ton of Democrats in charge, like the full trifecta. So it means that they're feeling strong.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Wondery, American history tellers, first ladies. What is it like to have a front row seat to the world's most important leaders and decision makers? That's what's explored in the latest season of the podcast, American History Tellers, First Ladies. When George Washington became the first president, his wife, Martha, became the First Lady of the United States. She had no precedent to follow and would have to define the role for future presidential spouses. American History Tellers examines the groundbreaking achievements of 5 of America's most remarkable first ladies, from their origins to the moment they courageously stepped into their role. Each of them refined traditions to leave their unique mark on history. Follow American History Tellers on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge this season, American History Tellers, First Ladies, early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus. Go deeper and get more to the story with Wondery's top history podcasts, including American Scandal, Legacy, and Even the Royals. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Wondery, American History Tellers, First Ladies. What is it like to have a front row seat to the world's most important leaders and decision makers? That's what's explored in the latest season of the podcast, American History Tellers, First Ladies. When George Washington became the first president, his wife, Martha, became the First Lady of the United States. She had no precedent to follow and would have to define the role for future presidential spouses. American History Tellers examines the groundbreaking achievements of 5 of America's most remarkable first ladies, from their origins to the moment they courageously stepped into their role. Each of them refined traditions to leave their unique mark on history. Follow American History Tellers on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge this season, American History Tellers, First Ladies, early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus. Go deeper and get more to the story with Wondery's top history podcasts, including American Scandal, Legacy, and Even the Royals.
Let's go to our second topic, which is I'm now going to basically follow up on the point you were making about the slow civil war in the Republican Party, because if it is so, okay, the Trump side won, and it's really amazing how much he won. I mean, not only do you have all of his vanquished rivals coming to the stage and not just saying nice things, but really laying it on thick. You also have the fact that he basically has controlled the legislative agenda in the House and the Senate, telling the Senate not to work on that immigration bill, working very closely with Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House. He's also obviously had enormous influence on the Supreme Court. Things are going well for Donald Trump, but are they just going well inside the hall? So, for example, Nikki Haley made her case, but there were lots of Haley voters voting for her even after she withdrew from the race in these Republican primaries. Does this version of the Republican Party, does this victory that you so aptly described, sweep the rest of the party? What happens to the group that's in the Civil War, as small as it may be? Is there anything that happened this week that's going to get those suburban Republican women back in, that's going to get those, disaffected Republicans to rejoin the party?
Is it suburban women that they're after? I guess I wonder. And I ask that because when you read what the Trump campaign itself is saying about where they're looking for voters, they're talking about hiring campaign workers who are the kind of people who are converts, who weren't voting or were disinterested in politics until recently, hiring them to basically go to their friends, get them registered, get them out to the polls. It's like a different play than suburban women. And I think, in terms of the Civil War and how that resolves, this Texas delegate I spoke to, this older woman, kind of stuck with me. She was clearly like an old school Republican, been in the party for a long time. And she admitted, she said, this is a unity convention. We're all unified. And I said, well, weren't you unified before? Like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, abortion. And I'm a Texas Republican who, she wouldn't say she was pro-choice, but clearly abortion was on her mind, was important to her. She didn't think that this was going in the right direction. But she could just swallow it for everything else. Like the feeling of winning is really powerful. It's like that old awful dieting phrase, like nothing tastes as good as thin feels. Like, I think that's what's happening with the Republican Party. Nothing tastes as good policy-wise as victory.
I'd never heard that quote before, and it feels so insidious. All right, let me shake that out of my head.
Sorry, John.
No, it's super. I'm so glad to know that quote now because I'm going to deploy it. Yeah, so, I mean, she's at a convention, so she's predisposed, but I think you're exactly right about looking for voters who, and the Washington Post did a lot of polling on this, which is basically people who maybe voted in an election before, but they have loose affiliations, not just to the parties, but to the process itself. And so Trump's making a play, and that's where the worker pitch from JD Vance and that you, when you talked about the worker party, you know, they maybe, that's the bigger focus, and that they think they can grow that share significantly to make up for the loss of suburban women. They will get some of the people that you interviewed there, and maybe some people who will say, if Nikki Haley can come around, I guess I'll come around. But they're not dependent on them the way they were in 2020 when Trump lost the suburban women vote, or lost a bigger share of it. And that, contributed to his loss. Were you struck, Mary, by how little talk there's been about abortion during this convention?
Yeah, I mean, there were like bubblings up of maybe we're going to have a floor protest. That absolutely, there's nothing like that. And that the protest would have been from incredibly conservative people who are upset that the new party platform only mentions abortion once. I think that's a little bit of a fig leaf. Like the new party platform basically is gunning for fetal personhood. So not mentioning abortion is kind of just, I don't know, a rounding error. So, yeah, I mean, abortion didn't really come up because the line is leave it to the states.
But shouldn't they be dancing in the aisles, high-fiving each other for this extraordinary achievement of the conservative movement, which has been patiently trying to dismantle Roe versus Wade? And they succeeded masterfully, and with the help of the person they are nominating. I mean,
well, they realize they can't do that. They're the dogs that caught the car, right?
Sure. But still, I just mean as regular old politics, if they weren't worried about its toxicity, they would be going bonkers. They'd have an abortion celebration night because it's such a victory. But I guess my point is, it feels the muted celebration seems proof of their concerns about its toxicity as an electoral issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so another of the people I talked to before I went to the RNC was Tommy Thompson, longest serving governor ever of Wisconsin. He served in George W. Bush's administration. He was responsible basically for getting the RNC in this state. He made the case. And I talked to him about abortion and where it was going in the party and how he felt about it. And like, he was wriggling. You know what I mean? Like, when I brought up to him, I was like, what are you guys doing? Like, what's happening here? Women are like not able to get the care they need. It's funny because his wife runs a women's health foundation in Wisconsin. Like, I knew this was something he would be familiar with and have something to say about, even if he didn't want to say it. And he was like, yeah, I feel so bad for those women. And his take was, I think every state needs to have a referendum. We really need to toss it back to the states. And I said to him, like, so you're saying this is a period of transition right now? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, well, this is a period of transition on the backs of actual women. And he was like, yeah, it's too bad. That was essentially the sentiment. But he was so excited. Like, this is another moment where I could just see how excited they were to win, the Republicans. Because whenever I asked him, like, how are you accepting Trump? Because you're an old school politician. He literally started running for office the moment he left law school. Very different than Trump. And he literally said, have you seen the crowds at his events? And I was like, sir, yes, I have. That's not what I'm asking. But that's what he was saying, which is like, we're winning.
Right. I mean, it is, nothing succeeds like winning. And Donald Trump, I mean, this is one of his great skills. Bob Costa and Bob Woodward interviewed Trump after he got the nomination in 2016. And I think it was Costa who said to him, like, okay, what are you going to do to like bring these Republicans back, on your side and, unify the party, which was still an issue after the convention. And Trump was like, they'll come. Like, they're coming. And man, has he been right about that.
100%.
I mean, even after they blamed him for an attack on the Capitol to disenfranchise 81 million people, which is the biggest breaking of an oath by any president. And they still came back. I mean, his understanding of the power of winning. And then the question is, what's happening to the Democrats?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if there wasn't the RNC this week, there would have been a whole front page news cycle about the Democrats who are still trying to figure their stuff out. And you saw this week, a push to let's nail down Biden and make him our nominee, and then a push back and reports that Chuck Schumer had gone to Biden and basically said sir, perhaps you shouldn't run. So it's messy. It's a messy mess.
It's a messy mess. Adam Schiff, Congressman, Senate candidate, Trump impeachment manager, has said that Biden should drop out of the race. A lot of people see the fingerprints of Nancy Pelosi behind that. I talked to Susan Page, Nancy Pelosi's biographer, and she's like, Nancy Pelosi loves Joe Biden, but she's not sentimental about vote counting and about the situation. And Jeffrey Katzenberg, massive Hollywood fundraiser for Biden, has reportedly talked to him and said the money's going to dry up. Where do you think we are, Mary? And this is a total vibes check, but there was an escalating effort to push Biden out of the race, which was going on. And there were some contentious phone calls with frontline House members with Biden on the Friday before the assassination attempt, which were reported to be both contentious and, for anyone worried on the call about Biden's capacity, episodes in which those fears were increased. Then there's the assassination attempt. Everything changes. It seems to have picked up again. Where do you think we are in the trajectory, since at some point there's going to be a convention? I mean, at some point the clock's going to run out.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't want to hazard a guess about where we are, but I will say this, which is earlier in this cycle of Democratic back and forth over Joe Biden, I talked to one of the first House guys to come forward and say, hey, Joe Biden needs to get off the ticket. His name is Mike Quigley. He's from Illinois. So he's about to host the DNC. And it was so interesting talking to him because I asked him, I was like, how much time do you think the Democrats have to make this decision? Because to me, I was like, you got a tight timeline. We're talking end of the week. We got to get it together here, buddy. He's like, we have until the convention. And I was like, are you serious? I think what I said to him was generous timeline there. And he was like, well, I'm just being realistic. And I kind of now think he was just being straight. He's like, we have cats here. We need to herd. And so we're going to need to take a little time here. Now, that makes things much harder for them. You're seeing the Republicans host this unified party. And I think there's a real question of how do the Democrats come anywhere close to matching that, given that there's this tick-tock going on of who are they even nominating?
Well, and the lack of enthusiasm, and also one of the signature challenges inside the Democratic Party is that they're asking their voters to not form the opinions they're forming with their own eyes and ears when they see President Biden in these interviews and these performances. That's a hard thing to do. And I guess the final point I would make in this topic before we go into the third is that now Biden has COVID. Even though, as you pointed out, there's not usually a response to the Republican, when conventions happen, the other party sort of goes away. But there are so many areas of rebuttal where an energetic nominee could take the fight to Republicans that just can't be taken advantage of, because whatever people may think of Biden, he can't do that.
Yeah. And he's busy fighting off, people who are coming for him in his own party.
Yeah. And by the way, doing his day job
Right.
which is a really hard job and massive things at stake, which I say all goes to the complexity of the challenge in front of them.
I'm David Remnick, host of the New Yorker Radio Hour. There's nothing like finding a story you can really sink into that lets you tune out the noise and focus on what matters. In print or here on the podcast, The New Yorker brings you thoughtfulness and depth and even humor that you can't find anywhere else. So please join me every week for The New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you listen to podcasts.
All right, let's go to the third topic, which is on Saturday, Thomas Matthew Crooks tried to assassinate former President Trump, wounded 2 in the audience, and killed 1. In the wake of the shooting, there was an immediate conversation that sparked about the level of political rhetoric. What have you made of that conversation, and is it the right conversation to have in the wake of this shooting?
I'm just struck by how little information we do have at this point, right? We know that the gunman was a 20-year-old. We've seen the videos of him on top of that building, and honestly, like the awful videos of people pointing, being like, there's a gunman on the roof. Hi. But for the last few days, the reporting has all been like, we're trying to break into his phone. We're trying to figure out who this guy is. And it seems like no one can get any purchase on that. He's a registered Republican. Maybe he gave some money to a progressive group. You know, and I just think back to Ronald Reagan, the assassination attempt against him. John Hinckley, his motivations were not political. They were about trying to impress Jodie Foster. So it's like we really just don't know what's happening here. All we do know is that everyone universally sees this as a WTF moment for the Secret Service.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, including the fact that the Secret Service was on high alert because there was an ongoing plot where they had some new chatter in the system about this. There's an ongoing plot against former President Trump by the Iranians as a result of his order to kill Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general. They were already on high alert.
Right. And if like this is what high alert looks like oof.
Yeah. But I am in such agreement with your point about the quick conclusion that this was politically motivated when there was absolutely no evidence to that. And we've already talked about JD Vance's over-the-top response. But I think I don't like the use of the word the media because of the way it gets weaponized by both parties. But in both the legacy media and then the chatter of the world, this immediate conversation sparked about political rhetoric, which I get. Political rhetoric has been high. Donald Trump has contributed to the escalation of that rhetoric and the dangerousness of that rhetoric. The CSIS study of political violence in the United States shows that there has been more of it on the right than the left. That conversation was difficult to have as everybody was breathing a sigh of relief that he was not killed, and also, managing the human response to Corey Comparatori's, the man who died, his death. There's a lot going on. So I have a sense of, some grace for all of our collective effort to find meaning in something, given the kind of where we are in our politics. But I think there's a huge problem from jumping to the political conclusion. As you said, it's not only like Hinckley, the two assassination attempts on Gerald Ford were not politically motivated. George Wallace's killer wanted to be famous. It turns out much of the time, the presidential assassinations are motivated by the idiosyncrasies and mental state of the shooter. That, of course, hasn't been true, though, with the plot to get Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, or the attack on Nancy Pelosi. She wasn't home. It ended up being an attack on her husband. What we learned in this case, according to the FBI, I did an interview with researcher Gillian Peterson, who, along with a guy named James Densley, compiled a database of all the life histories of 200 mass shooters to look for early warning signs. And I had interviewed the two of them for Face the Nation a couple of years ago after the Buffalo shooting. And what they found was a pattern of basically young white men who are alienated and who had some kind of trauma, like bullying or some other unresolved family trauma, and that they see public shootings and school shootings as an act of defiance against the forces they are angry about, which are not political. They are the forces that make them feel lonesome and picked on, and that they see these moments as a spectacle and that they are suicide events. They don't expect to survive. And that felt much more like it fit on all the facts as they were known than any political, because anybody who's political that we know in the world we live in, they don't hide that they're political. So I guess my point is, did anything useful? Because now we have reporting from the FBI that there actually doesn't look like there's any political motivation. He was looking for a target. He looked up Biden and Trump. He looked up the DNC. He also looked up depression. So he, at some level, was investigating mental issues that he may have had. Did anything come of this conversation about political speech? And should we stop that? Because there's a damage to it, I guess is my point, is to thinking... because this was the madness of a single person.
Well, we have to keep talking about, critiques of the policy stuff and critiques of who someone would be as a leader. And the problem is that, at least on the right, that is often taken as a critique of the self. And it's been interesting to try to talk about this here in Milwaukee with delegates, because it really does get to your point of it's not useful. Because the I'm rubber, you're glue principle really applies here. As soon as you bring up what do you think about tamping down the rhetoric? What do you think about X, Y, or Z? It becomes a conversation about the other side, X, Y, Z. And so I guess it depends what are you trying to do with that conversation by saying political rhetoric inflamed things here? Are you trying to reach people who you might not otherwise reach? Because I'm not sure you're going to do that with that conversation. Because I've seen it here on the ground. People who support Donald Trump, they don't want to engage with this conversation about political rhetoric. So we need to try to communicate in a different way with them.
I think the conversation about political rhetoric, well, first of all, it was a part of our worst instincts. And I associate myself with this, which is everybody just assumed this was political with no evidence. And that happens a lot. There's a lot of conclusion drawing on things with no evidence, and that's not great. The reason I think it's particularly bad in this case is that at some level it chills, which I think is what you're saying, the ability to talk about the fact that there is actual violence and the threat of violence that is not just theoretical. It took place on January 6th. The leaders of the Republican Party blamed the party nominee for inciting that violence. This is a conversation that should be had, but it's distinct from what happened on Saturday and clouds something that should be central to the election conversation.
Yeah, while we were here, Shana Roth, my producer I've been working with, who I know also works with you, John, we actually went to go meet with election workers a little bit west of Milwaukee. And it was just jarring to me to see here are these election workers who are going to have to carry out the election that we're all having a party about in Milwaukee. And these are very different people than the politicos you see on the floor of the convention. And what they were doing while this convention was happening was literally the sheriff was talking to them. 911 people were talking to them. And they were all basically trying to convince these people, please tell us about threats as you see them, even if you think they're not so threatening, because we're worried about you. And it was a real shot chaser moment for me where, you see what's happening in Milwaukee and then you see these people who are really on the other end of the political violence rhetoric. And we don't know their names, but they're doing something really important. They're trying to make sure everyone's vote counts.
Let's go to cocktail chatter, that one thing that you desperately need to push on your cocktail party participants to make their life more fulfilling. Mary, what is your cocktail chatter?
Okay. New York Times, best books of the 21st century. Have you been playing around with this, John?
I have, mostly feeling a sense of despair at the number of books I started and didn't finish that are on that list.
I'm so glad you said that because one of the things I thought as I went down the list was they have a check for I read it and they have a check for I want to read it. And I'm there's a middle way here, guys, because when I checked off all the ones that I have on my bookshelf or bedside table that I've maybe gotten 50 pages into, my stats went way up, I got to say. And I desired that for my, I don't know, personal reasons of wanting to feel engaged with the culture. But I liked this list just basically because it's fun to fight about a list. It's pleasantly divorced from the news or any news at all. And it's summer, so it's giving me something to think about going into vacation. Oh, yes, I really did want to read Demon Copperhead over vacation. So maybe I'll do that. And I was really excited that The Known World, which is on my top 3 books list, was in the top 5 of this list. It's number 4 for the Times. I just think it's such a good book. I had forgotten that it was part of this century, but I was really glad it was there because I love that book.
For me, it touches on the greater sadness of maybe the modern life, which is that I don't read books the way I used to. I have all these books from my college years when I was an English major, thick, big, huge books filled with outlining and notes in the margins. And I was I have no idea who that person was who could sit and read Bleak House over the course of a day and a half. I wish there were an app that was like, here's how we're going to walk you back to being able to read for 2 hours without moving. But I have this new solution to my life, which is I'm super nearsighted, so it's hard for me to read, but I just got glasses that are like half of my prescription. So I can't see past like my knees, but I can see a book, and it actually makes it easier to read. So I've just like returned to being able to read for longer periods of time. And so the Times book list is a possible, it doesn't fill me with the dread that it normally would be, which is like, oh, there are all these books I haven't read and I'm never going to read them.
I love that.
If you are a non-reader and need to watch television, I am recommending Shetland.
What is Shetland?
Shetland is a fantastic British procedural TV series. And it is about the Shetland Islands and the adventures of D.I. Jimmy Perez, played by a guy named Douglas Henshaw, who is amazing. There are also other great actors in it as well. Anyway, it's just really well done. It kind of consumed me in a wonderful way, to kind of just completely captivate your attention, which I don't mind at all.
What streaming service can I find it on, John?
You can find it, I think, on BritBox. Probably, I think you can also get it through Amazon or Apple TV. I think those are 3 places you can find it. And it's good. It's both a procedural, which is to say that you can hang out with it within its own episode. You don't need to like follow along. On the other hand, if you do follow along, there are some nice little Easter eggs and things. Plus, the Shetland Islands are gorgeous. I mean, it's so beautifully done, and the accents. I would suggest at the start you maybe put the subtitles on, because it's a little difficult at first.
So now I have something to watch until Slow Horses comes back.
Right, exactly. It's if you like Slow Horses, this is. I mean, it doesn't have the comedy that Slow Horses has, but it actually has one of the. I think it's the 3rd episode has some familiar characters from Slow Horses, and also if you ever watched Endeavour, one of the characters from that is in it too. So if you're a British procedural person, you'll see some of your friends in there.
Nice.
And we also have listener chatter. We are so grateful to you listeners for chattering in. Please keep them coming. This listener chatter is from Matt from the swing state of Michigan, from Holland, Michigan.
Hey Gabfest. My chatter this week is an excerpt of a video infographic recently shared on X by Nick Knudsen regarding the distribution of wealth in the United States. While it probably doesn't surprise anyone that there's a profound inequality in our country, I was struck by how drastically different the actual wealth distribution was from both what we think it is and what we think it should be in an ideal world. The top 1% of the population has more wealth than what the public thinks the top 20% should ideally have, and the top 20% has more than 4 times the wealth of the remaining 80%. Considering that the video was originally created more than 10 years ago, I can only imagine how much wider that disparity is today. It has really helped me understand why so many people say the economy is bad and moving in the wrong direction, in spite of all the economic indicators like unemployment and GDP growth indicating that the economy remains strong.
And join us on Slate Plus. Mary Harris, the host of Slate's daily news podcast, What Next? And I will talk about what Democrats could do at their convention. That's it for this edition of the Slate Political Gabfest. Sheena Roth is the producer of the Gabfest, but this episode, thank God, was produced by Ethan Oberman. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Operations for Slate Podcasts. Alicia Montgomery is Vice President of Audio for Slate. And our theme music is from They Might Be Giants. And thanks to all of you for listening. We'll see you next week.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather, now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply.